just going to give you a brief overview of the history of differentiation and where it came from, as described by Ian Stewart in his book 17 Equations That Changed the World, as you can see here. So the equation for differentiation comes from this version here, which hopefully you've just learned about in class. The history behind this is that this was developed by Sir Isaac Newton and Leibniz. They started developing it by considering the gradient of x squared. And what they wanted to do was to think about how the gradient changed by thinking about 2 points on the x-axis, which are a particular distance apart, and then thinking about how the gradient of that tangent changed as those points got closer and closer together. So Newton started out by introducing a new quantity, ohm, to denote a small change in x. When he did the algebra on this simplified out to be 2x plus ohm. And he noticed that if ohm became smaller, like it was flowing towards zero, the rate of change of 2x plus ohm gets closer and closer to 2x. Leibniz was over in Germany and performed the same thing, but instead of having ohm, he replaced that with a dx to represent a small difference in x. And then he defined dy to be the corresponding small change in y. So it was Newton that wrote the derivative of y by placing a dot above it, whereas Leibniz gave us the notation dy by dx. For second derivatives and third derivatives, Newton just used more dots. So you can imagine y with a dot dot, y with 3 dots, and so on. And it was Leibniz that wrote things like d2y by dx squared. Today, we say y is a function of x, and we write things like this. And when we differentiate that, we get things like y dash, y double dash, and we get f dash and f double dash. So that notation is coming from Newton's notation, whereas the dy by dx is the notation that comes from Leibniz. Integration is the inverse of differentiation. And again, it will be Leibniz's notation that we use over Newton's notation. It was Leibniz's notation that gave us this long-fashioned S, as in sum. Newton had no systematic notation for the integral. So there were other mathematicians, such as Berkeley, who argued that it makes no logical sense for Newton and Leibniz to maintain that a smaller quantity, Newton's ohm and Leibniz's dx, is non-zero for most of the calculation, and then to set it to zero if you've previously, especially if you've previously divided both the numerator and denominator of a fraction by that very same quantity. Because remember, division by zero is not an acceptable operation in arithmetic. So Newton worked on this, and he saw ohm not as a fixed quantity, but as something that flowed or varied with time. And he said that, yes, this thing gets closer and closer to zero without actually ever getting there. The derivative was also defined by a quantity that flowed, and it's the ratio of the change in y to that of x. Berkeley dismissed this idea. He didn't like this idea, and he said it's the ghost of a departed quantity. Leibniz tried to justify his method in terms of infinitesimals by saying that this term, this dx in his case, wasn't a fixed non-zero quantity that is arbitrarily small, but a variable non-zero quantity that can become arbitrarily small. Fortunately, the physicists and mathematicians of the day had an alternative way to make sure they were doing something sensible: comparison with observations and experiments. The maths that was being generated here and being produced here did fit scientific observations. So Newton and Leibniz's answer to Berkeley was the concept of a limit, and that this function or variable h or ohm or dx tends to a limit L as h tends to zero. So that's where we get this notation here, that the limit of the function of h, as h tends to zero, we get it to this limit L. We take the limit as h tends to zero. And that's where we get this idea here. So nowhere in the calculation do we ever divide by zero. Nothing here actually flows. The limit L is the ghost of a departed quantity. The h that the author has used in the book here, Newton's ohm, and Leibniz's dx. It approaches zero, but it doesn't actually reach it. Historically, calculus now had a sound logical basis. It deserved and acquired a new name to reflect its new status, and it was called analysis. A nice sort of finish to this. For all those people that say, why do we need to differentiate? Why do we need calculus? Ian Stewart has written that it's no more possible to list all the ways that calculus can be applied than it is to list everything in the world that depends on using a screwdriver. Just in case you didn't catch it, this comes from this book here, Ian Stewart's 17 Equations That Changed the World.